All right, we are live on YouTube and we are live on Zoom.
All right.
Excellent. Hello, all the virtual watchers out there. Glad you're here.
You know, this is always my favorite part, to watch the attendee, you know, like the number change and the names populate into the list. Welcome, everyone. I hope you are having a lovely start to your afternoon. As we have everyone enter into our little webinar Zoom room, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat section. Before you go ahead and hit enter or return, don't forget to send it to the panelists and attendees so that everyone in the room can see your welcome message. We look forward to learning more about you and getting started this afternoon. Excellent. Welcome. And Deidre, good to see you again. And yay, an SJSU graduate. Always lovely to see. Hi, Cynthia. Welcome back. We have some really amazing educators out there, and this academy is just really kind of putting a spotlight on that. I see a lot of return names, which makes me so happy, and also, you know, not restoring, but, you know, uplifting my my belief that teachers are amazing people who give up their summer time to do more learning for their students. Excellent. Oh, welcome, Judy. I hope the weather is lovely in New York City. And if you're just joining us, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat and send it to all panelists and attendees so everyone can get to know each other before we go ahead and get started. We were just talking about pizza, yes. Oh, excellent. Welcome, Diane. And welcome back, Armin. And Evangeline, good to see you again. Oof, more thunderstorms. Okay, yeah. Fingers crossed it can blow on through and you'll be lower humidity and sunshine in no time. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome, Tabitha. And it's hot, Kate. Yes, that's what I hear. Oh, welcome to all of our attendees. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a little bit, in just a few moments. And we will make a couple of announcements in those next few moments, but go ahead and introduce yourself and get to know the other participants in our webinar this afternoon. All right, we're going to transition to just a couple of announcements just so that we can start as close to on time as possible today. Just a quick reminder that a recording of this event will be available on our K-12 Academy website. And that captions are available for this webinar and in the recording as well. If you'd like to access those captions today, you can just go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the live transcript. And they will populate into your screen for you. This is a traditional webinar, so your video and audio are automatically turned off. But please do use the chat to communicate with one another and our presenter throughout the presentation. And then just a little plug for our Facebook group and our LinkedIn group. The links are right there in the chat for you. So if you'd like to keep up on everything Lurie College of Education here at San Jose State, this is the place to keep in the loop. So it is with great pleasure today that we at Lurie College of Education introduce our webinar, Considering Community and Trauma. And today's presentation will be given by Dr. Lara Irvin-Kassab, and she's an assistant professor here in the teacher education department at San Jose State. So thank you for being here. We are excited to get started. It looks like we have a lively audience according to that chat. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so very much. I just posted into the chat a link to our slides for today. Please feel free to click the link if you're someone who likes to follow along with the presentation. While I am opening up and sharing my screen, I'm an assistant professor of teacher education. I teach a course called Creating Classroom Communities. Basically, for those of us that are old enough, it's a class about classroom management, but management is from a student agency, socially just community approach as opposed to teacher directed, teacher controlled. So we are going to have a conversation today. This is more of a conversation than a presentation. So I really want to encourage all of you to get active in the chat, as well as to raise your hand anytime you have a question. I'm more than happy to slow down, to stop. Oh, the link requires access. Okay. I thought I could have everyone view it. Hold on one moment. So welcome to one of the areas that I work with is technology and how to. Okay, so what I'm going to do is change this to anyone with the link, copy a new link. Here we go. So you're getting a little behind the scenes technology tutorial for those of you that have never had to do this, although after a year in COVID, probably all of us have had to do that. So that was probably not new. What I would like to share with you though is for those of us who are really bothered by having multitudes of tabs open, this is your bonus for getting here right on time. If this drives you crazy when you're about to do some teaching online or talking to other people online, my favorite add-on is this little blue button right here. It is called One Tab. And what it does is when you click on One Tab, it will collapse all of your tabs into a nice handy dandy sheet that you can access at any time, and it'll keep all of them for quite a history back. So that's just your little bonus there. So now look, I have just a beautiful little One Tab here open, and the other one is that one that I'm going to use. So there's your bonus technology tip before I dive into our actual content. All right, so here we go. So here are the 3 goals I have for us today, and hopefully we will, I know, right? People in the chat are like, wow, yes. Sometimes it's just those little things that are really important to be able to walk away with. But I'm hoping that we'll also be able to walk away with these 3 skills in mind. And if you will read these to yourself and then go ahead and post in the chat, which of these 3 are you most excited about today? And just share the first word. So consider ways in which we might rebuild our classroom communities with trauma and joy in mind, share resources and ideas on strategies, critically reflect on practices and experiences. So which of those, consider, share, or critically, are you most excited about? Go ahead and post in the chat. Excellent. So go ahead and you can continue to share as you wish. One of the things that I talk about with my students is we share objectives with students. And a lot of times when we're sharing our objectives with students, it kind of feels like we're reading something to them and we're the teacher on the Snoopy cartoon show, wah, 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 wah. So this is a great way for modeling, actually having your students engage with the objectives, have them be able to then tell you as an instructor which things they're most interested in. And then I usually debrief with my students talking about, like, I've seen in the chat the word consider come up the most, then sharing resources, and then the critical reflection. So that helps me as a teacher also think about where should I expand and contract my just-in-time pivoting as a teacher. So there's another handy dandy little tip for you. So let's dive right in. Our agenda, we're going to do a little mindfulness to think about mindfulness as a way of opening up opportunities for celebration and joy, and also being aware of trauma. Then we're going to talk about context really quickly. And then we're going to have 3 different engaging activities around reconnecting relationships with students, reconnecting relationships between students, and reconnecting to curriculum. And finally, hopefully we'll have some time here to get into a critical reflection. What are we learning about ourselves as educators in this process? And then we should have about half an hour left to be able to do some questions and answers. I'm not a fully strict, like I am presenting right now, all questions to the end. So if a question comes up for you during the conversation, please feel free to throw it into the chat. So we're going to start with an entrance ticket. How are you feeling today? And we are actually doing this using Pear Deck. So please feel free to, oh, Cracker Jack. Is it working? Are you getting the options here to be able to click on? Help me out, Rebecca, do you have?
Yeah, I have the slide open and I'm only seeing the bar, and I am a novice at the old Pear Deck here.
Okay. Can I put a link in the chat? That is a great question. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to pivot.
Do you want me to put the options in the chat for you?
Sure, that would be great. Or people can do what Armin just did, which is fabulous, which is also, you can go ahead and type in how you're feeling, or you can go ahead and put in A, B, C, D, or E. Excellent. Awesome. You know, these change always much more relaxed during the summer. Becca put them into the chat up atop. Yeah, so this is just a reminder that a lot of times when it comes to our teaching, we can use a really quick exit ticket to just to just be able to get a feel of how things are in the room, how our students are doing, and again, informing us in our potential future pivots during our teaching during the day. So this is a social emotional learning strategy to just do an entrance ticket on where we're at. So don't worry about the PD code. Everything that says Pear Deck from here on out, we're just going to do in the chat because I set it up and it's not working. So, all right. So one of the things I do in my class is I start every class session with a mindfulness activity. And because I teach both multiple subject or future elementary school teachers and future middle and high school teachers, I have tried to collect, and I'm in the process of making videos and posting on my YouTube channel, mindfulness activities that take 5 minutes or less. So we're going to talk here for just a moment about how mindfulness might help us in our classes and help our students as they are returning to the classroom, to the physical classroom. All of the mindfulness activities I do can also be done in a virtual space. But when we think about why mindfulness is necessary, thinking about where we are in this time and place. In the United States, in 2020, we are just coming to the point where some of us have been in the physical classroom with some of our students. Some of us are returning for the first time in months to physical classrooms with students. And our students are coming in from an environment in which we've had COVID pandemic worries. We have had a lot of political and social conversations going on that could cause us some stress. So one of the reasons why I start every one of my class sessions with some mindfulness is thinking about cognitive load theory. And so the cognitive load theory is this idea that our brains can only actively work with about 7 things at one time. And when we think about everything we're coming into the classroom with as human beings, that's already taking up some of those 7 slots. So what mindfulness allows us to do is to kind of take a moment to be able to check in and connect with ourselves, and then to also be able to maybe lighten a little bit of that cognitive load, to be able to be aware of things that might get in the way of our learning throughout the day. So here are my tips for using mindfulness, and then we're going to, in just a minute, do a mindfulness activity ourselves. So one of the things you want to do is, when you're thinking about using mindfulness, come from a space of inquiry and be sure to explain to your students what you're doing and why. Why are we doing mindfulness? I love the videos that are out there, but just throwing up a mindfulness video isn't actually going to help students authentically practice mindfulness. Just saying, here's a mindfulness video, let's all do it along with it, oftentimes perpetuates this idea of kind of compliance and performance, as opposed to actually getting out of mindfulness what you can get out of it. Keep mindfulness short. Some of those mindfulness videos are 15 to 20 minutes long. And those 15 to 20 minutes, that's just, it's going to impede some of your class time, and it may actually be longer than your students' attention span. So for me personally, I use mindfulness in a very short way to help us get ready to get into the content. Be a participant in the mindfulness activities. So the videos I'm going to put up on YouTube, the intention is that ideally you watch the videos, you practice doing the leading of the mindfulness activity, and you lead your students through it, as opposed to just putting up a video again and telling your students to do it while it's really hard, because I know all of us want to do attendance. All of us want to, get those last couple things graded in the grade book. But if you really want your students to authentically practice mindfulness and get the most out of it, you need to be a part of that practice as well. Mindfulness can also be a space to really open up and honor different cultures. A lot of the mindfulness strategies are coming out of yoga traditions. And so being able to connect to the culture, choosing different genres of music, different world musics to listen to for musical mindful moments, allows you to open up opportunities for students to learn about other cultures and to celebrate the joy of the creativity of multiple cultures. The last tip is actually kind of a caution. And that is that when we as human beings start practicing mindfulness, we are tapping into knowing who we are and how we feel about things. And it is possible for students to feel trauma or have a trauma response, or at least anxiety or worry when they are doing mindfulness activities, because we are directing our brains to think about sometimes things that our brains are pushing down. Okay, so let's do a mindfulness. And this mindfulness activity was brought to my attention from one of my students, from that student's mentor teacher. It's very quick. It's a mindfulness strategy you can do as a whole class, and that you can also explicitly encourage students to use when they feel themselves getting stressed. So this is something they can do independently as a way to kind of calm down, right? A lot of times we tell kids who are upset, calm down, but we don't help them learn how to calm down. So for this activity, everybody go ahead and get into a relaxed position. If you want to shake out your shoulders, if you want to roll your neck, if you're standing, make sure you're standing in a comfortable way. If you're sitting, make sure your shoulders are in line with your hips, so you have a nice, good space for your lungs to be able to expand. Okay, so get your body into a relaxed position. Hold your hand near your face as though you're holding a flower. Okay, and then breathe in deeply like you're smelling the flower. So a nice deep intake through your nose. And then you can point your index finger or your thumb up and imagine that it is the wick of a candle and slowly blow it out. So this is basically a mindfulness activity to help students start to learn how to breathe deeply and attend to how they're feeling. So everyone, let's do it all together. Hold your hand to your face as though you're holding a flower and take a nice deep breath in. Smell the flower. And then blow out the candle. Feel free to do this on your own, maybe 1 or 2 more times. When you first start learning to breathe deeply into your lungs, be conscious of the fact that this can make you lightheaded. So only do this maybe 2 or 3 times with students initially, so that you don't have anyone fall out of their chair. So when we think about mindfulness, inside and outside of the classroom, when I'm in a physical classroom, the ways I use mindfulness in K-12 is at the start of the day or the class. It's a great way to do transitions in a more calm way. And also final reflections on the class. To some mindfulness activities are thinking about diving into metacognition. What did we learn today? What do we want to know more about? Mindfulness is also extremely helpful in times of stress. So I was teaching on September 11th, 2001, and wish that I would have had more mindfulness activities in my back pocket, because it would have helped my students in times of stress that's nationwide, in times of stress that's in the school, in the classroom. When we're using these activities in our classroom, our physical or virtual classroom, we also want to think about how what we're teaching them in the classroom can be connected to outside of the classroom. And so we can think about how can we communicate with our parents and families that our students just learned how to do this deep breathing, smell the flower, blow out the candle. As a parent, my student would often come home from school and tell me something that they just simply assumed all adults knew because it was something they did in class. So if we can actually help our parents know and our families know what we're doing with students in the class, that can help them help us back up students, give students more agency in being able to use some of these strategies when they're facing a stressful situation outside of our classroom. So go ahead and put into the chat any questions, or if you're already doing mindfulness, what are some of the tools that you've used or that you really like? Any references? This is a great opportunity for us to share. So, excuse me, tools or questions, go ahead and pop those in the chat. And while you're popping those into the chat, I'm going to show you the hyperlinked resource I'm providing. So it can be questions or resources. Headspace. Breathe like a bear book. Ooh, earplugs and asking them to follow their heartbeats. 5-finger breathing exercise. 5 senses exercise. Awesome. Guided meditation, square breathing, go noodle. Awesome. So if you take, these are awesome activities. Calm app, guided meditations that are story-based. Wonderful. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Common Sense Media, but Common Sense Media is a nonprofit organization that has all kinds of reviews of apps and games, books, movies, and TV. It's geared towards parents, but also towards teachers. And the link that I provided in the slideshow are some meditation apps for kids. And as you take a look, you'll see what the apps are, the age recommendations, and different ratings and descriptions for each of the various apps that they've got on here. And they've got this for more than meditation, but this is just a really nice kind of location for getting some additional resources. Smell the flowers and blow the candles. Awesome. Calm app. Cool. So you're sharing some suggestions. Does anyone have any questions or would like to share a little bit about their own experiences with mindfulness? What is square breathing? That's a great question. Deidre, would you be willing to unmute your mic and tell us what square breathing is?
She can't unmute, but she can type it in the chat.
Oh, okay. I thought Brian had set up unmute. Did you?
Yep, I've given her permission to unmute if she'd like to.
We did that sneakily before you got here, Becca. I'm sorry. So hopefully, Deidre, I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Yeah, Dedra.
Dedra.
Nice to meet you. It's
Nice to
actually a YouTube link, and there's a couple different square breathings, but you can do it 2 ways. You can use the YouTube video, or you can just have the children draw a square and trace their finger down, breathing in for 4 seconds, and then across, hold their breath, and exhale, and then up, hold, inhale, and then across, exhale. So it's kind of, and you kind of do it for 4 seconds on each side.
Nice.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that it's incorporating the physical movement, right?
Yeah. And they do have a YouTube video that has a fish swimming along if you have a visual learner. But I kind of liked for my kids that were at home, they could draw it in a little note on their whiteboard and even erase it as they went around. So just some ideas. Yeah. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you for sharing. I'm going to look that up when we finish today. So Nancy is asking, are there ways to make mindfulness exercises a bit more culturally relevant and appealing to students who are not as willing to participate? That is a great question. I'd like to actually start with the appealing to students who are not as willing to participate. One of the things that I do in my class, and I did this when I was teaching K-12 as well, is when I'm teaching any kind of metacognitive strategies, if I'm teaching mindfulness, if I'm teaching something that's extra to the content, I will often have my students kind of reflect when we're finished with whatever that strategy was on what did it do for you? Did it do something for you that it helped you? And we have open and honest conversations that not all strategies work for all people. Not all study strategies work for all people. Not all writing strategies work for all people. Not all mindfulness strategies work for all people. So we're going to try a selection of different mindfulness activities, and that I ask all of them, similar to the way I was with my my child and food, to at least try once each of the mindfulness activities and think about, does it work for me? Does it not work for me? And so I found that that is very helpful towards getting students to participate and try things out, with the caveat of, if they find one that does work better for them than when we're doing one that doesn't work for them, they could do that other, like more silent or more personal mindfulness activity, but just to make the space in our day to take a moment to recenter, to refocus. And what I've found is the students who are not as willing to participate are more willing when you are doing the mindfulness activity along with them, simply because then everyone around them is doing it. Culturally relevant. So yeah, one of my favorite mindfulness activities is doing an attention to your body while you are listening to a piece of music. And so one of the great spaces that I've found is being able to bring in music from a lot of different cultures and a lot of different genres, and then attending to our physiological reactions, like, is your toe tapping? What's happening with your breathing? What's happening with your heart rhythms? Are you finding this calming? Like attending to your brain and your body while you're listening to music. That is one space where the mindfulness exercise can tap into cultural relevance. I also do a mindfulness activity piece where we all together sit for a moment and just kind of indulge in deeply looking at a piece of art. And so that's another, so it's kind of, when you think about some of these mindfulness activities and exercises, when you start tapping into the visual and performing arts as well, that's where you can have a world of finding culturally relevant materials, having some really good conversations as we debrief. When we listen to a piece of rap music, what did that do physically to us? Like to a piece, classical music from a specific genre of classical music, what did that do for us? So that's a great question, and hopefully that was a really long answer, but hopefully that was a good answer. Any other questions or inspirations, things that you're thinking you'd like to try now? Oh, yes, Sarah, definitely. Lots of drawing and names. And having a quiet personal alternative and some space for that, wonderful. Cool. All right, I'm gonna move along. So part of the name of this is thinking about trauma. And so the next couple slides are going to be about trauma and the time we're living in. So thinking about the context in which we are right now, a lot of us we are going through periods of isolation and stress. Isolation from COVID, and even social distancing is a form of isolation, even though we can physically see one another. I don't know about all of you, but go ahead and put a yes or letter Y in the chat if you miss hugs. That's one of the things I miss the most right now. So feeling this physical isolation, sometimes social and emotional isolation and stress. Our kids are all feeling this too, right? And adding to that isolation and stress is also a lot of social uncertainty that has been happening since 2019. The political uncertainty, the tragedy and uncertainty around the George Floyd situation. And so when we are looking at what's going on with our students, a lot of times we have this kind of idealized way of thinking about students, especially when we first start teaching, and thinking that, you know, they're kids, they're not paying attention to any of this. But absolutely everything that is happening in the world, the students are part of that world. And no matter how young they are also exposed to these same isolations and stresses. So we need to be aware of the fact that as we are returning to school, our students are coming in. Remember those 7 pieces of cognitive load? Some of those pieces of cognitive load are being taken up by the stress of things that they're experiencing and sometimes don't feel like they're able to talk about. So in the links on this particular slide, I have included a couple readings. One of them is from the National Association of School Psychologists that posits that a lot of the successful transitions students are going to have coming back into the classroom are based on what their pre-COVID relationships were with school and their social support outside of school. So when we think about our students who didn't like school, who are all, by the way, my favorite students are the ones who didn't really like school, because I like to find ways to get them excited about learning again. But when we think about our students who didn't like school before COVID, as we come back, COVID's not going to make that better, right? It's going to continue to reinforce that negative perception. Our students who love school might actually have an easier transition because they're excited to be coming back. Thinking about how students have a healthy or unhealthy relationship with emotions can also play a role in how successful we are in helping bring our students back, and how are they being taught by culture to suppress emotions, right? Like boys don't cry, girls need to smile all the time. Those aren't necessarily healthy relationships with the emotions of happiness and sorrow. So as teachers, we need to kind of keep these contexts in mind. Mental illness in the home or self is definitely something that is coming more to the forefront, as well as thinking about fight or flight responses and freeze responses, and how those reactions physiologically are pushing chemicals into our brains that can impede our openness to learning. Again, for this particular slide, shared the slideshow. In the speaker notes are some resources with a little more information on this. And at the end of the live stream, I can go ahead and copy the resources into the live stream commentary boxes. So thinking about all those things going on, one of the things I wanted to share with all of you is my story of what has gone on during COVID, hopefully as a opportunity for you to think about your own stories, and also to think about what things may have come up for your students. So I am legally blind, and the picture here on the right of the person driving a car while holding their mobility cane out the side of the window and feeling for the bumps in the road is something I joke about all the time with friends, that, you know, hey, just let me drive, I'll stick my cane out the window. I'm also on the neurodiversity spectrum, or autistic. And one of the things I found is that during COVID, I have really struggled with a lack of structure and organization. So as we're moving back into a face-to-face classroom, I think about my students who might have some of the needs for structure and organization, and they've gone for a year or more now without that structure and organization. I struggle with communicating, oversharing or undersharing, and sometimes word choices. So thinking about coming back to the classroom, our students who may struggle with communication may really be nervous. They may be bringing in some emotional pieces because they haven't been communicating with others for so long. And then any of us who have problems making connections with others or struggle, challenge to make those deep connections with others, are coming back to a face-to-face classroom without the, like, we may have forgotten all of those tools that we have built prior to the pandemic on how to make connections with others. So that story is in order to kind of ground us in this idea of when we see things happening, thinking about root causes, thinking about how we might be approaching bringing students back into the classroom and helping them make that transition. The American Institute of Stress published an article on traumatic stress. And here are some things that we might see our students doing. And as we take a look at this, I'd like you to just think for a minute, are some of these things that in the past would result in a disciplinary action? So if we saw a student in school having difficulty focusing, or if we saw a student in school refusing to cooperate with schoolwork, having aggression, needing to be physically near you as the teacher, are there some things that in the past we have looked at these as discipline problems as opposed to stress-related problems? I'm going to just be silent for a moment. And if you'll pop into the chat, are any of these things that you have felt, or like, I know I get really uncomfortable with extreme emotional reactions. So are any of these signs things that you might react to because you too are experiencing some of this traumatic stress? And go ahead and pop any ideas or questions into the chat around any of these pieces. All right, I'm going to go on to see questions, inspirations, and suggestions. So any questions about these things, anything we want to know more about, any ideas that came up for you? We're all teachers in here. So I know as we've been thinking about these things, what are some things that have popped up for you as ideas or inspirations or questions? Yes, thank you. Thankful for therapy. We definitely need to advocate for more support as our students are coming back in, more support for our students. Seeing these same things with our kids at home, it's hard not to react, especially when we've experienced them as well. Yeah. And that's actually a really good, there you go. How do I respond? Great questions. Great questions. When we're thinking about how we respond to these things, this kind of cycles back to an inquiry as opposed to a reactive approach. So when we see our students having difficulty focusing, I've got a couple slides here in a minute that have some suggestions for responses, but stepping back and instead of saying, you know, like personally, I'm uncomfortable with extreme emotional reactions. And so in the past, my response has often been, I just need you to just step away from me right now, right? Step outside. I taught high school mostly. So step outside and to try and get myself away from it. But in cases of traumatic stress, we need to also think about following up with the student. So do you need to step outside for a moment, as opposed to telling them to step outside? Once they have stepped outside, give them a couple minutes to calm down, then step outside and say, what can I do in order to help make these things, you know, I noticed that you had a reaction. Is there something I can do as the teacher in the classroom to help minimize your stress? right? Not minimize your reaction because that makes the student feel bad, but to help you minimize what's causing you pain. Judy. Judy, would you unmute and talk a little bit more about what you're talking about here in the chat?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I've been, for the most part, teaching in person since September. New York has been extremely hard hit by COVID. Every single person that I know has had, including myself and my family, has had somebody either very sick or die from COVID. So the kids were like so excited to be back in school. But we saw kids, washing their hands every 15 minutes, taking gloves and putting them in their desk, refusing to pick something up off the floor if they dropped it. We had a kid who had his pants on backwards, and the principal asked him to go into the bathroom and put his pants on correctly, and he refused because he was afraid to go into the bathroom. So we're seeing a lot of that kind of anxiety-related behavior. You couldn't, if you tried to pass out a piece of paper, no, I can't take a piece of paper from you. So this sort of combined with like relief that they were in school and happiness that they were in school, but, these sort of things that present themselves as sort of this anxiety kind of behavior.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for being out there in the front runners of going back face to face. So those are things that I don't know most of us have really thought about in advance, right?
We weren't prepared for it. We just weren't.
So yeah, what things, would you mind talking a little bit about what you tried doing or how you tried to approach it?
I mean, one thing that we did, and I'm just a teacher, I'm not an administrator, but we talked about sort of backing off the kids in terms of dress code. Our school is very conservative, very strict. We talked about backing off in terms of dress code violations. Of course, we communicated with the parents as much as we could. And we also sort of had little safe spaces, or at least for me, like I also teach theater. So I have little safe spaces for the kids that they could just hang out. Like, you want to sit in my office? Sure, just come sit. I have to stay 6 feet away from you, but you can sit here. I have Hershey's Kisses. You can have a Hershey's Kiss. Like, that's really it. Like, I'm not a therapist, so it had to be very careful. Like, I can't diagnose anybody. I can't treat anybody, but I can just hold space for them. And that's sort of it. I felt like I couldn't do much more than that, except, to say I'm here. Let's write a little bit. We did, and I'm an English teacher now. I wasn't before. This was a COVID thing, like, because I was a theater teacher, but I had antibodies, so I had COVID. So I was hired with 10 minutes notice. Please teach English. New York had such a teacher shortage, so I started teaching English. But yeah, so just sort of a lot of like writing about what is it like to be in school right now, and then just sort of holding space. Like, I'm here. We can just, chill out a little bit, trying to be more flexible about deadlines. Yeah.
Awesome.
I know.
So everything you did, speaking as an educational researcher, is consistent with research.
Wow.
Woohoo! Making space, allowing time for students to process, giving students some structures for processing. All of those things are things that are things we can do as teachers, and I really appreciate and would love to reiterate that we all need to be clear that none of us are psychologists. We are all teachers, right? We don't have that degree. We don't have that background. We do what we can do. So as I'm looking here in the chat, some of these are also additionally, so make space for processing, make physical space, make time, being flexible and helping students be flexible. But Vanjie has said here, realizing that we need to kind of take our default reactions to aggression and difficulty focusing that would in the past have been, I need you to stop that, I'm going to give you a warning once, then we're going to do a detention, but rather taking an understanding, patient, and resourceful sort of way of doing that is another piece to thinking about how we can approach these ideas. And then I also, Kate is saying, how do we keep ourselves from knee-jerking? Right? Because we have all of these students in our classroom. And Judy, having been a theater teacher myself, Judy and I see your number of 40 people there, and we think of our freshman theater classes, which can be up to, right? Because the administrators go, you're teaching in a theater, look at all the seats you have. So theater, choir, PE, sometimes 40 is a low number for some of us, although that is a very high number for elementary. So since we don't want to knee jerk at all, let's go through a couple more of these slides here. And I think we're going to hopefully have some ideas. But thank you, Judy, for suggesting. You've done great work, and I appreciate you sharing, as well as everyone in chat. Go ahead.
And Laura, if I could just interject, I think just because the nature of this webinar, we are able to interact. So why don't we extend through the Q&A portion just so we're able to get through the topics? Does that sound okay with you in this format until, not until the end of the hour, but halfway through the next?
That would be awesome if we could.
Absolutely.
All right. So look, anticipating that these questions would come up, what can we do? So that knee-jerk reaction, starting at looking at the coming towards student behaviors from a lens of inquiry, not judgment. It's human nature to often put on others our own reasoning. So when a student acts in a certain way, our very first filter that behavior is going to be interpreted through is, what would my reasons be for doing that thing? And when we take a step back and we come at things from a lens of inquiry, we are really aware of that tendency to go to, I would be doing that thing because I was mad at the teacher, right? And instead saying, I need to ask the question of, why is this person, this individual doing this thing, and kind of try to pull my inferences out of it and my judgments out of it. The number one thing I would say that is going to be the most essential in the first weeks and months coming back is knowing your routines, following them, and having that structure. Because we are coming out of a very unstructured environment, it doesn't matter if you're teaching pre-K or preschool or seniors in high school or university. We've had such an unstructured life that the routines and the structure are really important for us to have. So kind of thinking in advance, what is it we're going to have and how are we going to remain consistent on those routines? Modeling for our students and not being afraid to be vulnerable on what does it look like and feel like to have emotions. So Kate brought up, she doesn't want a knee-jerk at all. Neither do I. I don't think any of us enjoy a knee-jerk reaction. But I don't know that we can stop it from happening every time. So when speaking of my early years as a teacher, there were a few times where I lost my cool, I lost my attention, my temper, and I might have raised my voice once. And one of the things I did was apologize to my students. And I remember during that time, my students saying, Miss E, why are you apologizing to us? And I said, because that's what you do when you lose your temper, you know. So like modeling for students that adults can take on those same responsibilities for our actions that we're asking our students to do. And don't be afraid to have a conversation with your students when you're doing that initial entrance ticket and checking in on how everybody's doing. Don't be afraid to say, here's how I'm doing too, guys, when I'm having a really stressful day. Just want to let you all know in advance, things are happening in my life that have me a little stressed out. I'm going to try really hard to be patient, but if something comes out snippy, please, you know, give me the raised eyebrow or the slow down signal and remind me that maybe I'm a little more snippy than I think I am. We need to be honest with our students. So this is a hard one. We need to be honest when they ask us what's going on with this. When September 11th happened, that entire day for me was throwing out my lesson plan and having conversations with my students, listening to them and their concerns that in our very suburban California town, like, what's going to happen? Are they coming after us? And instead of scoffing and saying, are you kidding me? Like, we're not even on the big map for the for the world. Most people don't know where we are. But instead hearing them, acknowledging that that is a feeling that we might have, it's okay to have that feeling, and then to kind of walk them through, like, let's take a look at what happened. Let's think about why and where, and then thinking about what do you think the likelihood is, right? So coming at calming the student down from a perspective of taking their perspective first. As much as possible, love that Judy had mentioned being flexible on assignments. Think about taking that flexible on assignments to the next level of providing students control as much as possible. And providing structure and practice for students on making, like, quote unquote good decisions. Just giving them the opportunity to think about, like, where can they have some autonomy and agency. Providing a decompression space. In my classroom, I had a quiet corner that students could make use of for up to 3 minutes at a time, little egg timer, comfortable chair. They could sit back there, turn the egg timer over, decompress, calm down. It was a cell phone free zone. Of course, back then we didn't have cell phones, but just a space for them to stop for a minute. And then thinking about, our culture has a lot of words, our culture, United States, has a lot of words for happy feelings, and a lot of opportunities for, like, pushing things aside to be happy and so on and so forth. But we can also provide students with a vocabulary and opportunities to think about all of the emotions, and that it's okay to be angry, and it's okay to be sad, and it's okay to be nervous and curious and all of those things. And even putting content as secondary to giving students the opportunity to build relationships, empathy, and practice kindness. Again, on this slide, there are some attached articles, and I'll put those into I'll give them to Brian to hopefully help me put onto the live stream. So here we go. Destroy the idea that repressing emotions is a sign of strength. That's something we all need to really kind of take a moment and sit with. So a lot of the tips that I just gave you came out of research, and as a good teacher researcher, I find it's also really important to set context by asking some experts. So informally, I interviewed 3 students, an elementary student who's going into 3rd grade, a middle school student who's going into 8th grade, and a high school student who's going into 10th grade. Caveat here, these are all, it's a very small group of students with a very narrow view. They're my nieces. So I interviewed them all to try and get a perspective from a student. And I asked each of them this question: what is it that you want teachers to keep in mind as we come back to the new normal? So the youngest student, the elementary school student, said, give the students extra help. When students are struggling, there's a lot of concern about being behind. So thinking about when we're planning our lessons in the past, trying to get all of the standards in all at once, how are we thinking about maybe looking at which standards are the most important ones to cover and which ones we could let go of in order to be able to provide that space for students who are worried about being behind. And the other concern that she shared with me was that it's going to be hard for us to connect with each other until they have a vaccine for under 12. So echoing what Judy was saying about students being worried about disease transmission and so on and so forth, really, like, this is something that our elementary school students are thinking about. So in the chat, based on these pieces, what routines or extra supports are you thinking about now? Or what ideas do you have about helping students connect to each other while being socially distant, especially those who are unvaccinated? Go ahead and you can post in the chat any ideas or inspirations or questions. Emphasizes that we need to ask students what they need, not just tell them the schedule for the day. Yes, Becca, absolutely. That's one of the ways I stay low inference, is to ask my students. They all can tell us what they want or need. Yeah, Armin, when students see each other masked and socially distant, it still makes a difference when they're out of the house. Absolutely. And that actually leads really well into our second person, who our 8th grader, going into 8th grade, who wants us all to think about and remember that students are all individuals. So some students are super excited to come back and see each other. They're very excited about this, getting back and making connections. But some of our students may actually feel really vulnerable due to their home, their life, or their worries about school. Our students who are coming in who had a hard time adjusting in the first place might feel really worried about speaking up in school, and remaking those very connections. Awesome. So I thought that this was a really important quote that she said, "We adjusted to social distance and not being around people. So give us more icebreakers and time to adjust to being around people again." She actually suggested that for the first 2 weeks, we take time to build connections and community. And I have a Mentimeter for us to do, if we can do it really quickly. This is a community building activity I do with my teachers. And if you'll go to menti.com, you can use the QR code or the link. And the link is now also in the chat. Just think about, what are 3 words that describe you as a teacher, and put those words into the Mentimeter. And then what will happen is, excellent. So I love using word cloud generators, both face-to-face and online, as community builders, as ways for us to see what we have in common, as ways for us to connect to one another. For those who are not familiar, what word clouds do is they take whatever words come up most frequently, and those words are larger, and the words that come up less frequently are smaller. So we can see right now that our teaching community here right now in this workshop is one in which many of us are supportive. We are kind and passionate and compassionate. And as people add, we'll see the different words change: playful, loving. I see anti-racist, inclusive, intuitive, empathetic. So I do this with my students around who they are as people, around Sometimes this is something I'll use when I want my students to think about in English class, characters or settings. In history class, what are their interpretations of a certain event? But just thinking about these little things that we can do that provide students with an opportunity to have voice and an opportunity to see how they are part of a community. Judy, if you have a quick connection story while I'm getting ready for the next slide, that would be awesome. Please unmute and share.
So at the end of the year, we were finally allowed to have the kids 3 feet apart instead of 6 feet apart. We were still wearing masks. So the school decided to do a sing-along, grade, just the whole grade in the gym. So the kids were singing, and a group of boys decided to put their arms around each other and sway with the music. And the vice principal immediately ran over to them and said, "Boys, I'm so sorry. We can't do that yet." And the kids were disappointed. And I looked at my colleague sitting next to me. I said, "Give me your lanyard." We wear our IDs on a lanyard. I took his lanyard. I took my lanyard. I ran over to the boys. I put one side of my lanyard in one kid's hand, another side of the lanyard in the next kid's hand, and down the line. The principal ran over with her lanyard. Other teachers ran over with their lanyards. Then the program director ran to the gym closet, got a box of jump ropes, and gave them out to all the kids. So all the kids were now swaying and connected by a jump rope. And to me, it was like the perfect story of we can stay connected, even if we have to be, 3 feet apart, 6 feet apart, whatever. All the kids were connected with these jump ropes and swaying to the music. That's my connection story. Yeah.
That is a beautiful connection story. I know, chills, tears,
Right?
all of us are, thank goodness I didn't wear mascara today.
For us, it was the end, it was towards the end of the year. So all year we had been waiting to sing together because we hadn't been able to sing together all year because New York was so strict. So it was a beautiful time to see the kids together and connected.
That is awesome and beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you for allowing me to.
Yeah, and that's actually a great segue to, if you'd like to post in the chat here. We're running out of time, but quickly, what's your favorite get to know each other activity, right? Do you have one that you do that you can share with us here as part of the sharing of resources? Yeah, the word cloud is a pretty cool activity. It's also helpful if you're trying to identify key vocabulary that you need to teach to copy and paste into a word cloud, because then you see the high frequency words in that particular reading piece as larger than the others. And thank you, Judy, for sharing. If I'd known you before, we could have done this as a duo. All right, so since we are running out of time, I do want to give you the high school students' perspective. To keep in mind, knowing and letting us study our interests and make the work meaningful. So one of the things that resonated with me about Judy's story is that being creative in thinking of another way to be able to accomplish the task of being able to sway with one another, right? There's some great comments coming up in the chat for things that are good team building, community building. But we need to get to know our students, and the way that we can get to that point where we can be flexible and we can get creative is to focus on what the ultimate academic purpose is of whatever it is we're trying to do, and thinking about, is it something that is routine? Are we giving homework for the sake of giving homework? Or are we giving homework because it's actually furthering learning? If it's for the sake of giving homework, we need to cut it out. We need to look at the academic purpose of what work we're asking our students to do. And when we think about that academic purpose, we can get kind of creative with it, because we can look at ways in which we can provide voice and choice for students. So whatever the academic purpose is, the students could show us their mastery of that academic purpose in multiple ways. And another suggestion directly coming from the student was making spaces for students to have a voice in how the class itself, the learning space, is being run. So if you're going to play music, you know, maybe do a survey at the beginning of year with different kinds of musical genres that students like, setting up comfortable chairs and spaces, those spaces where students can process through. And this meme, I pulled it from Facebook. I don't know if anyone else here has seen it yet, but when we think about connecting to our students, this just really resonated with me from a pediatrician, and that I think this goes along with us as teachers too. What are the things that we need to have a favorite of so that when our students bring up that thing that's their favorite, we can connect with them? If you'd like to add to what you think the list is of, it's very important as a teacher to have a favorite. Go ahead and pop into the chat what things you think it's important for us to think about and know about to be able to share or connect with students. For instance, I need to have a favorite anime or manga. Favorite book character and why? Favorite candy, cookie, and soda? Songs from various genres? Excellent, yes. Favorite neighborhood store? Getting to know the neighborhood. All of these are things that we need to be thinking about as possibly more important to have conversations around with our students than content, right? We need to think kind of about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need to Maslow before we can bloom. So food, water, shelter, connection / love, and then we can get to where our brains and our bodies are ready for learning. Favorite food my mom cooks. Favorite video game. Oh, yes, Vanjie, absolutely. Fast food or snacks. Favorite color, animal, or book, right? So being able to think about in advance what these things are. Even though I'm now older, I still listen to contemporary pop music so that I can have the ability to connect with my students on what it is that they're listening to. I think that's almost an unwritten part of what we need to do as teachers to be prepared to teach. So since we're closing in on the end here, the last piece is our reflection piece. And I think that this is extremely important. We've been talking for the past, since we started, about how to make the space good for students, how to welcome students, how to help students. But this is directly from me to you. You cannot pour out of an empty cup. As we're thinking about our students and helping our students transition back, we need to think about our own social, emotional, mental, and physical well-being. We need to be thinking about our self-care. We need to be thinking about our community care. We need to recognize and refute toxic positivity, which is that kind of like superhero narrative that we have around teaching, that like we're here to help everybody and putting ourselves last. We can't put ourselves last and do the work of supporting students in any kind of effective way, because we are going through exactly the same things that our students are going through. We can recognize and refute the kind of deficit focused default of the educational system, where when we're looking at a piece of student work, when we're looking at student learning or student outcomes, we focus on the things that are wrong. And I think we do this, well, I do it. And from thus far, when I talk to student teachers, they do it too, that when we look at how we did in a lesson during a day, the first thing we talk about is what went wrong. The first thing we think about is how we could do things better. The first thing we do is kind of beat ourselves up a little bit about the problem. And sometimes we'll internalize it, right? And so instead, taking a step back, and when we catch ourselves starting with everything that went wrong, stop ourselves and start with, what did I do well today? Right? We need to fix our language and our mind systems. We need to focus on our community and how we are supporting one another. And that community can be this group of people right now. That community can be your fellow teachers at your school. It can be your family, your local community, but how are we making sure we're taking care of ourselves and each other, not just our students? So I have a link again at the bottom of the slides. Cult of Pedagogy is one of my very most favorite blogs to read. And here are 4 habits, general habits of self-care for us to think about. And I'd like to ask us all to be vulnerable. Reading these 4 items, which of these 4 is the one you personally are going to potentially struggle with the most? If we all committed to these 4 things and taking care of ourselves, go ahead and put a number in the chat. Which one's going to be the biggest challenge for you? I'll be honest and start number 2 for me. So it looks like we've got a lot of 2s and 4s in here. And see, Mita, 2 and 4 both. Yes, absolutely. A couple of 1s. So acknowledging that we know these things are going to be challenging for us means that we can start to put our attention to when we start doing these things. So focusing on the habit of the habit, valuing right actions over right results. Would someone who posted number 4 like to unmute their mic and tell us how you interpret that number 4? Or post in the chat how you interpret number 4.
I know I am a self-admitted perfectionist, as many teachers may or may not be in this room. And I like to do things the right way, right? And sometimes that doesn't always go the way that I want, and that can be frustrating, right? Developing routines, or, you know, in spaces with students, I think especially doing right by them, even if it doesn't go correctly, or, you know, the way we envisioned, if you will, knowing that at the end of the day, you took those right actions, even if at that moment it didn't go over the way that you thought it would.
Excellent. And not giving up on the habit just because it didn't go well, right? Progress over perfection. Yes. Yes. Awesome. So when we talk about toxic positivity, a lot of toxic positivity is this kind of dismissal to get us to a positive and happy space, and to not acknowledge the crunchier feelings. So this is a quick little meme. I'm a memeaholic. I'm just going to tell everyone right now, I should be in a 12-step program because I love memes. But just thinking about our language, right? And how often we've heard or even said a version of, you know, it's okay, you're going to get over this, you'll survive, you're going to be stronger because of it. And instead saying, this is hard, acknowledging the struggle, and I believe in you. Instead of telling people don't be negative, right? Dismissing those more uncomfortable feelings, saying things like, it's okay to feel bad sometimes. All of us do. It is healthy to feel bad or sad or upset. So again, this is one of my favorite kind of structures for really thinking about the language that I use and the approaches that I use with my students and myself, right? So when we look at this, how many times are we telling ourselves some of these things on the left-hand side when we should be telling ourselves, instead of failure is not an option, right? Tying into that number 4 perfectionism, failure is a part of growth, rewriting the voices and the narratives that are happening to ourselves. A recommendation I have, if you have not read this book, it is a really good book, not only about stepping into a more aware anti-racist perspective, but also interrupting some of those ideals we have and expectations for ourselves to go in and like save a community, right? Or save a student, right? That the narrative of most mass media gives us, those television shows about the inspirational teacher who's going in and saving the lives of the students, Mr. Holland's Opus, Robin Williams in Dead Poet Society. Media gives us this idea of what it means to be a self-sacrificing teacher. And not only is that not good for us physically and emotionally and mentally, but it also isn't necessarily good for our students. So I would recommend, if you haven't read it, the book For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too, Reality Pedagogy and Urban Education by Dr. Christopher Emdin. If you look up Dr. Emdin on TED Talks, he's got some great videos. If you are currently like, I can't add one more book, he's amazing. So finding ways to interrupt that, not only for our students, but also for ourselves. And then this is, I think, my last slide, or my second to last slide. And one of the things I do is I critically reflect on myself as I'm planning. When I'm reflecting on my planning, I try to stay focused in the academic purpose so that I can streamline what it is I'm really looking for and the ways that I want to be able to be creative for my students and provide universal design for learning, voice and choice, to be able to re-envision what it is I'm teaching and think about ways that I can be more abolitionist or anti-racist. Some of the questions I ask myself when I'm reflecting on the routines and the ways that I react to my students is I take a beat and ask, am I doing what I'm doing because it's always been done this way? Or am I doing it because I see my students having a positive reaction? How am I tuning into my students' reactions to discipline in order to minimize the trauma of traditional practices, like getting a detention, getting a suspension, even having a call out of serious disapproval in our classes is traumatizing to our students and ourselves. And then thinking about how ultimately is everything I'm doing helping myself and my students restore joy, love, kindness, and curiosity in ourselves and one another. And I'd like to acknowledge Armin and Andrea and Vanjie's statements in the chat. Yes, telling each other it's okay to cry, and trying to find that space to make boundaries so that we can make space for ourselves and our families is important. So I think that's my last slide. So we have 8 minutes for open questions or comments or ideas. Gosh, I really appreciate all of you participating in the chat and being a part of this today and sharing your stories. So I'd like to open it up to any questions, comments, or concerns that you might have. I'd even like to invite you to unmute your mic if you want to and share. And thank you, Decca.
It's interesting that the concept of boundaries have come up too, because I think that that's been something that my ears have been hearing a lot in the past few months. And I think that that's come out of, right, the year and a half we just all experienced.
Yeah, and I think as teachers, like the profession itself, our culture is one where we're constantly student focused, student facing, which is very important to do. But we also need to remember there's some self-care there and setting boundaries for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And if you didn't see Brian's message, you can just raise your hand and we can unmute you if you are interested, or you can type a question in the chat.
I'd love to hear more stories if people have more stories they'd like to tell.
And it looks like we do have a hand up.
Okay, it's me again. It's Judy again. Sorry. So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I teach, like I said, my school is very conservative. It's a private school. A lot of our students are very privileged. And that's actually what I want to ask you about.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I talk to our students about in the beginning of the year is how privileged we are just to be in school, right? And some of them really got that, but for some of them, they're like, whatever, no, we don't get it. And, you know, all of us in New York anyway, have seen Black Lives Matter protests, you know, in our neighborhoods. And for a lot of the kids, they were like, that's so obnoxious. How dare they? I couldn't sleep because they were making so much noise, whatever. Like, how can we communicate to those students that, you know, the protests have a meaning, and communicate the gratitude for being in school and being together and being in person? I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does. It really, really does. So I think our students often have a hard time understanding these things in the abstract, right? If it's something that's not happening to you or someone you know, it's really hard. I think when we try to approach it through fiction, which is where a lot of us who have an English teacher background will tend to go, well, I'm going to have them read, you know, a fiction story like Black Boy or like Invisible Man. They still may not get it as well as looking at some of the media that's out there. And one of the shows that I have found to be good at kind of providing space to have conversations is United Shades of America. W. Kamau Bell does a series for CNN, and you can find it on all over the place. But that is one way. I think finding ways in which they are hearing and seeing stories of real people and providing space and structures to talk about, like, once you build a strong community, you can talk about almost anything. You can't do this at the very beginning of the year, but we can have conversations about race. We can have conversations about religion and gender and sexuality and sexism and ableism. Once we build those strong communities, and then it's just a matter of finding the right pieces that are going to resonate with your students. And we have to know our students well enough to figure out what those pieces are that will reach them, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes tremendous sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, I get that. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments? You have 3 more minutes. You can even ask me what my favorite pizza topping is if you want.
Well, I want to know that.
The answer, oddly enough, is SpaghettiOs and
Ooh.
hot dog and hash brown nuggets.
I'm coming to your house next time you're cooking that pizza.
Anytime. I've found one of the things during this COVID is playing around and experimenting with foods and cooking, because we're finally stuck here, so we can get creative, and asking our students to think about what's the weirdest combination of pizza toppings you can think of, and then actually trying to make it for them and taking pictures is a fun adventure in inspiring creativity, which is another thing that I think we've had unstructuredness, but not creative unstructuredness during COVID. So providing space and structures for students to get creative is also really important. But that's a whole nother workshop.
Absolutely. And Judy, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I'll tell you my other connection story. Hopefully this will be useful to somebody. But we had a lot of kids sort of in and out of quarantine. Like if they traveled, they had to be in quarantine. If somebody in their family was sick, they had to be in quarantine. So I had one of my classes was a very difficult group of kids, and there was only like 11 kids. And one day we had a bunch of kids out in quarantine. So I only had 6 kids that day. So I said to them, we're going on a field trip. Now, field trips, we were not allowed to have field trips this year. No field trips at all. And they gasped, oh, Miss Todd, what are you talking about? We ran down 7 flights of stairs because we can't stuff everybody in the elevator. We got to the front desk. I told the guard, I'm taking the kids to CVS. The kids went nuts. I have 6th graders. They went crazy. We walked to CVS, which was like 2 blocks away. We bought poster board for them to make posters. They talked about it the rest of the year. The field trip took a grand total of 9 minutes. I timed it because the guard was like, don't stay out too long. The kids had just had such a great time. So, I mean, it's those simple things like of building community. It cost me like $3 in poster board, and the kids just kept talking about it like the whole year. And the kids who were out were like, oh, I got to come back to school, because they had the option this year of learning online. So that all the kids were like, we have to come back in case she ever goes to CVS again. But it was just those little things this year of, being together and doing stuff.
Awesome. There's a really great question in the chat, if I can take just a minute here. And that was, what do we do when they completely refuse the structure, right? And so here is my approach to everything. And that is, whenever you're introducing something new, start it socially. Don't add in content until, if you're trying to get them to learn a form, don't start it with content they haven't learned yet. So if you want them to learn an argumentative structure, start with something social. Which is better, Snickers or Reese's peanut butter cups? Pepsi or Coke, for those of us who were alive in the 80s and remember the great Pepsi Coke battles, right? Like, start by teaching the structure through something familiar and social, so that A, it gets them engaged and hooked in, and B, it's lowering the cognitive load. They're not trying to layer in learning new content with learning a new structure. When I teach my students how to use a technology I'm not sure all of them know how to use yet, I do something like, the 3 words that describe yourself as a teacher. I'm not asking you like, what 3 pedagogical theorists were most influential in your teaching approach, right? No, it's something that's, who are you? What are things that you like? Starting all of those things with the social before you move into the content. And I also really want to project out Sarah's comment as kind of a really good closing comment. And that was, when she went back with kindergartners, it was about asking the students what they wanted to do. And if you walk away with this, with nothing else, self-care, and when in doubt, ask your students what they want to do. they can express themselves. It may be challenging to get a coherent answer. You might have to ask follow-up questions, but students of every age can tell you what's important to them. And that's why I reached out to my 3 nieces who are, you know, students. What is it? What's their voice in what they want? And I really want to thank you all for coming today and sharing your time with me in the summer.
Excellent. And with that, I just also want to say thank you, Dr. Irvin Kassab, for such a wonderful time today. I think we had such a nice hour and a half that was completely integrated with participation, and the attendees. I mean, thank you so much for staying on and being a part of this. And thank you for all of these strategies that I think are really, really important to all of us as we head back to the classroom. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you everyone for attending. We hope to see you back next week. We start on Tuesday with more webinars for our K-12 Teaching Academy that is put on by the Lurie College of Education.